It says turn off original sound. Does that mean I should do something?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It's a quiet meeting so far. I'm just saying.
Highly unlike Walter to not be, so he must be having connection issues. We're trying to reach him. Being from Norfolk, they don't have the technologies we have down here.
Ooh.
Boy, I've been in nonstop meetings since 3 o'clock, so and I've got more after this one. Yay for days ending at 7 o'clock. So if any of you aren't part of the Madiver market yet, you better get on that.
What's that, Joel? Explain again.
I said, if any of you aren't in the Madiver market yet, you should get on that since we have nothing else to talk about at the moment.
What, are you part of the organization committee, or do you know
Yeah,
how many they have sold?
Yeah, we're up at, I think we're over 350 members. I don't know what the exact count is right now, but yeah, we're getting up there.
COVID must have interrupted.
We've added, I think we were at around 300 before COVID hit. So we've added members, but it's hard. I mean, when you can't,
Right.
it's a community organization. When the community can't get together, it's kind of
Yeah.
hard. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's what I have after this. I got a board of directors meeting.
Are you, you are active? Is Phil Allen still active with
Yep.
that? Yep. I miss
Yes.
people.
Good peoples.
Yep.
So anybody know what they're planning to do with that 10 Bridge Street building that was bought for $1.53?
What have you heard?
I heard a group of like 7 people bought it and that they want to do something with it, but I have no idea what that something is. But
Have
they
you
all
heard
pitched in.
at all what they want to do? Anything?
I heard they all pitched in like a quarter. But I have no idea what they want to do with it.
I'm curious. No one's reached out yet to ask any questions, or maybe they're meeting with their engineers, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe that or they paid their $1.53 without realizing what they were really getting into. But
They're local guys, the Matthews.
I think
Right.
so, yeah.
Yeah, like that Matthews family is a big family.
I mean, I'd be surprised if it wasn't 6 million just to get sprinklers and windows in the place. So
Right. I think that's the worst of the 2 buildings.
yeah, oh for sure. And it's huge.
Bigger, right?
The main building's like 60,000 square feet. A little over 10,000 per floor, 10 to 12,000, and then there's like a side building that's like 15,000, and it's pretty much a tear down. I'm not sure anybody's gonna have any use for that bit that was tacked on the back. But it's such a cool building. I mean,
Yeah,
the way that it's got that courtyard and like the drive-through, and
right.
me
I
and my
remember
brother.
Marty had some big plans for it. Like he had envisioned like an outdoor restaurant on a patio between the 2 buildings.
Going
And
over the river. You know?
yes.
I think a lot of people want to have something like that on there. Me and my brother used to walk through, and when we were kids, we would walk by it and we'd look down into the open courtyard and imagine, I don't even know what it was, like apartments, I think, that like overlooked some beautiful courtyard with all kinds of plants and stuff.
Right. It could be nice if someone had the drive to do it and the money.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
No amount of millions is too much as long as you have a realistic plan for making enough money to pay for it.
Right.
Of course, one of the biggest issue with it at the moment is parking. The parking is just not there.
Not right there, but I mean, if you walk around here on a Friday afternoon, like really none of the streets around here have limited parking. I mean, you walk 1 or 2 blocks,
Yeah,
there's plenty of, municipal parking.
it really depends. I mean, what are you gonna fill it out with? I mean, you fill it out with apartments, you put 50 something apartments in there. There's not parking for 50 people. And you put something like a big store or a grocery store, they need like 120 parking spaces. It's just hard. I've heard some people's plans, like to try to acquire other real estate and turn it into parking around it. Demolish the back building, try to build a parking garage, but it's all extra costs to go with it. But man, if that building and the Capital Products building actually got turned into something cool, Winstead would have a whole different look to it.
Yeah, it's really bright.
And, I also think it's somehow it's important that theater, Gilson, keeps operating indefinitely.
Yeah,
I mean, that is like the central anchor of the town.
It's true.
it's one of the most unique things we have here. Definitely, I don't think it's the most, but it's big. But that's probably struggling for the same reason a lot of them do, is that you need you need storefronts that are attracting people in. If people aren't coming into the storefronts, they're not shopping at the adjacent storefronts, and everyone suffers. And we really need to get those storefronts filled out.
I just saw
Run.
We just have an update. We were able to touch base with Walter and he thought it was at 6. He'll be right on momentarily.
I think the original announcement was for 6.
I'm
And
looking
then-
at the agenda. It says 5.
Yeah. No, the agenda does now, but the initial thing that I saw was 6. And then when I saw and I thought I was going to have to not go to the Madiver Market meeting, which is at 6. But then I saw the invite come through at 5, and I was like, hey, good to go. So he's
I
probably
had-
crazy.
I had to check it 10 times. I didn't know if it was 6 on the 5th or 5th on the 6th.
Transposing numbers.
And now I've broken
I
my
did the
pencil.
same thing.
John, are you doing any traveling? Have you scheduled anything?
For me, just traveling. Well, I've got nothing exciting or fun, unfortunately, at the moment. I got a relative I have to go visit in Michigan. It's not well, but
No.
it's not exactly exciting, but no adventures right now. How about you?
No, but I'm eager. Here we go. My husband's the Clark Griswold. He's looking around and couldn't even get anything in Maine in September.
Oh, yeah, I hear it's crazy to rent
Yeah.
anything.
I mean, in
We've got a
September?
vacation rental in Maine that you could probably rent in September. My family does anyway. We reacquired the family home up in Greenville, which is on. Moosehead, Maine.
Wow.
Of course, I don't know if you're planning to go that far into Maine, but Moosehead Lake's like up there.
Right.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello,
Hi, I
sir.
am so sorry. I had this down at 6 o'clock and I feel terrible about it. So I'm sorry to have wasted, 20 minutes of your time already. Let me just try to get this situated. Okay. So shall we jump right in?
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. Many apologies. I was actually just.
One moment, sir. Just we are fortunate tonight to have our new town manager. If he wanted to add a little bit to start the meeting, and Walter, you can get a beverage there, and then we'll be ready to go.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to jump in before, but thanks, Joe, for giving me a quick introduction. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to meet you all. I'm sorry that it's not in person, but I'm sure that in the next few months we'll have the opportunity to do that plenty. But my name's Josh. I'm the town manager. If you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, or you can always come up and find me here in Town Hall. And I'm happy to hear that there's some training going on. I'm hoping, just so you all know, that we'll have some FOIA training in the near future too for all our different boards and commissions. Please feel free to reach out, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, I apologize. Still sort of catching my pulse back from the call. Let me, by way of introduction, thank you for the invitation. My name is Walter Godlewski. I have finishing up my 4th year on the Norfolk Board of Assessment Appeals. When I was elected in 2017, it was sort of an interesting year because we had one person who was acting as chair who had been on the board for a number of years, and he carried over. We had an assessor who'd been in town for years, and then everyone else was new. 2 new members and 1 new alternate. So we were fortunate to have a lot of experience for our first year, and we learned a great deal. And then the following year, our assessor retired and moved to Florida, and our chair had health issues and had to step back. So we basically spent a lot of time reading statutes, reading handbooks, and making sure we knew what we were doing. So with that in mind, that's sort of my background. I'm also an attorney. I'm not providing any legal advice tonight to anyone, but I think it's helpful as far as, statutory language really isn't foreign to me. So, and I've spent a lot of time reading these statutes. So with that in mind, I thought I would just sort of approach this from a big picture with some background and then sort of move down into how we conduct our meetings, some of the issues that have arisen, some anecdotal information, and then open it up to Q&A if that works for everyone. And I think, you know, overarching, the number one factor for me as far as the BAA goes is that we are elected officials, and we're basically elected to make sure that the distribution of tax obligations in our municipalities are fair, just, and equitable. And we accomplish that basically by serving a quasi-judicial body. You know, we have taxpayers and the assessor on one side, we have the Superior Court on the other side, and we're really the intermediary there. We hold hearings, we listen to evidence, we deliberate, we make decisions. We don't set policy, we don't set mill rates, we don't have legislative duties. And although we all may have opinions, you know, the mill rates are too high or this certain property shouldn't be taxed, we really have no, this is not the forum. The BAA is not the forum for expressing any of those opinions. You know, we are basically elected to apply the existing laws and regulations fairly. And the key to that is to be fair and impartial. And we all know all of that. And, you know, I think it's easier said than done. You know, I always look at our overall goal is two people with roughly similar property should be paying roughly similar, same amount of taxes. And how do we do that? We have to make our assessments very evidence-based, and we have to make sure we apply the same standards to everyone. We can't just reduce an assessment because we feel bad for a taxpayer or sympathetic to a hardship. And the Board of Assessment Appeals handbook, you know, is pretty clear that those are sort of the principles by which we should work. The other sort of overarching thing I think that we need to keep in mind is that ours is a formal hearing. We conduct formal hearings, and as such, we should always err on the side of formality. You know, in fact, the BAA handbook states that not only our hearings are to be conducted under oath, but they should be conducted in a dignified and judicial manner, and the BAA members should assume professional demeanors. And that can be challenging. You know, I'm in a town of 3,000 people where almost everyone who comes before me, I know. So if somebody walks in, you're like, hey, Christine, how you doing? And I think that's fine. But, you know, I think we do have to be serious about this and view ourselves in a judiciary role with the same gravitas that one would expect at another formal hearing. And I think one of the things we want to do is make sure that we do that anyway, because pretty much anything we do is subject to appeal. And the last thing anyone wants to do is be embarrassed by an unfortunate remarks that become public or then become part of a court proceeding. So those are sort of the big picture. The only other thing I would talk about is alternates. And I raised this, we don't have any alternates currently on our board. I would love to have some, but there have been some questions in the past as to what the role of the alternates are. I've looked into Connecticut guidance with respect to that. And while there's nothing directly addressing Board of Assessment Appeals, there is Connecticut case law regarding zoning boards. And it makes it very clear that alternates may participate in the hearings. So for instance, while we have a taxpayer in front of us, an alternate or a regular seated person, you know, member can ask questions, but the minute we move from hearings to deliberations and decision makings, those alternates really cannot be involved. You know, our former chair used to ask the alternate, you know, what are your thoughts on this? You might have a valuable input. That's a no-no. We can't do that. So I just raise that because that's something that, you know, we've recently learned, and we're, you know, if I had alternates, I would be imposing. One of the other big questions that seems to always arise is a relationship with the assessor. And I'll touch on this a little bit later, but it's really a balancing act. And I think it's an important balancing act. No one becomes an assessor or joins the Board of Assessment Appeal to make friends. You know, taxes are not popular, and I don't find that Any of us are very popular. And to a great extent, while we're reviewing the work of the assessor and possibly making changes to it, all of us are really in this together, and we all share the same goal of making sure that our town's tax burdens are fairly and equitably shared. There are differences in opinions. You know, any taxpayer who comes before us clearly has a different opinion as to what the fair market value of the property that's been assessed is than the assessor, or they wouldn't be before us, and each of us individually may have them. So, you know, I think we walk a fine line here. I think we need to work closely with our assessors. We need to understand their assessment processes. For instance, you know, the one thing that jumps out at me is that assessors have certain guidelines they've got to follow, particularly motor vehicle assessments, let's say. I mean, they are dictated. You follow the NADA guidelines for, you know, a good condition vehicle. And, you know, they may know that somebody owns a beater, but they don't have the power actually to make that change. Those people have to come before us. So, you know, let's keep in mind that there's a lot of anger directed towards assessors sometimes. There's frustration on our part when folks come, you know, year after year with car assessment challenges. But, you know, it's better we understand how our assessors work and that they're not evil, they're not our enemy, they're simply doing their jobs. I think the best we can all work together. And what we've really found from our board, having worked with two separate assessors with very different personalities, is that, you know, the two keys to our successful smooth operating is one, developing a positive working relationship with the assessor. And the other is working really hard to establish open communications. You know, we find that there's certain material that's particularly helpful for us, for instance, in our deliberations. Well, we have to communicate to that to the assessor. And, you know, if some of us find that 3 years past assessed values or 5 years is more helpful, she has no way of knowing that if we don't communicate it. So, you know, I would just encourage everyone to work closely with your assessor, but at the end of the day, don't forget that we, as boards of assessment appeals, are independent review bodies. We're not rubber stamps for the assessors, and we're not advocates for the taxpayers either. We're the intermediaries. And I think that when you sort of look at our roles and responsibilities in that light, it almost makes it easier to do our work because we all know where we stand and where our positions are. I will very briefly touch on probably the two key aspects of the law that apply to us. With the introduction, I heard that you guys will be doing your FOIA training soon, which I think is fantastic. That's actually the second thing I'm talking about. The first, very briefly, is, you know, we're governed by Connecticut statute. And particularly Connecticut general statutes, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot, but Title 12 is taxation. Chapter 203 is property tax assessments. And there's a lot in there. It's a heavy lift to read it all, but I would recommend that every member of the Board of Assessment Appeals read sections. It's 12-110 through 12-117. It's 7 sections. It's 5.5 pages that are printed out. And it's a really concise summary of the procedures that we have to follow. It was funny when I first started, you know, 4 years ago and was green behind the ears, we were given these little packets of information that I went through again in preparation for this presentation. And I discovered that one of them was, I had come up with these 7 sections myself, was those exact 7 sections had been Xeroxed by our town assessor. So, you know, it's taken me 4 years to come around to realize that she gave really great advice. My other advice would be just read the table of contents or the headings for the rest of that section. I don't think you have to read it all, but you should be familiar with what else is in the statute for when issues arise. And for instance, section 1262, that basically sets out the whole revaluation of real property process every 5 years. So every 5 years, it probably makes sense to read that one section. Section 12-107 A through F, that's what's called Public Act 490. It comes into play with farmlands and forest lands, those issues arise every once in a while. It's good to know it's there. It's good, you hear references to where the hell is Public Act 490? Well, who knew it's in, the taxation section. Over here in Norfolk, the two things that really come into play for us are farm machinery and horses. So it's good for me to know those sections. So I would just recommend, read through the table of contents, know it's there, know where to look. Don't bother your time reading it now, but know that it exists. FOIA. I don't want to ruin your training that'll be coming for Freedom of Information Act, but this is something that it's so important to what we do. And basically the Freedom of Information Act in a nutshell says that meetings are open to the public and the meetings are defined as, and I'm going to read a direct quote. Any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency or gathering of, or italicized, capitalized, communication. So it's not just a meeting or gathering, it's communication, very broad. By or to a, all caps again, quorum of a multi-member agency to, all caps, discuss or act on any matter over which it has authority. These 35 words have a bunch of potholes thrown in. Communication, super broad, covers email, covers casual talk. You run into one of your board members at the post office. Those are communications. It covers telephone calls. And what really kills us here is Board of Assessment Appeals that have 3 members is quorum. Because with a commission of 3 people, 2 people constitute a quorum. So, my husband is the vice chair of our Planning and Zoning Commission, and there are 7 people on that. He and the chair can have a conversation, and there are only 2 people. They don't constitute a quorum. So it's not, there's no question they're not really taking an action on behalf of the Planning and Zoning Commission. If I run into any other member, or if I email any other member, and we discuss anything, even discuss, we don't have to act on it, discuss over which we have authority, under this definition, that's considered a meeting. So the fact that our commissions are so small really handcuffs our ability to communicate with one another. There are certain exceptions, chance or social gatherings not intended to relate to official business, or communications, this is important, communications limited to notice of agency meetings or their agendas. So I can email my commission members and say, hey, here's the notice. It calls for a special meeting, in a couple of days. Do y'all think this looks okay? Or here's a draft of the agenda. Do you have anything to include? But other than that, we are super limited. And in fact, the secretary of our commission had, who also happens to be a lawyer, used to draft up minutes and send them to after our meetings and send them to me and the other member and say, hey, let me know if you have any comments. And I reached out to him actually to remind him of our FOIA obligations and said, I don't think you should be doing this. And he's like, no, this is outside of FOIA. This is just administrative. This isn't something over which, we have to be concerned about. So the Norfolk elected officials 5 or 6 weeks ago had our Zoom meeting with Tom Hennick, who happens to be the head of public education for the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission. And I threw that hypothetical out to him directly. And he was in 100% agreement with me. He's like, you cannot do that of the commission your size. He's like, any discussion you should be having over minutes, even if it's correcting things, that is something your board has control over. And that's something that needs to be done in a public forum at a public meeting. So, my advice to you all when it comes to FOIA is, when in doubt, be overly cautious. And, it's hard even for the commission this small to come up with best practices. So what I've done with my commission is I remind everyone every year of our FOIA obligations. I encourage us not to do any communication by email. And, inevitably someone will forget, we only meet every 6 months. Someone will forget and send an email. I will not respond. I will reach out to RSS and I'll say, hey, can you talk to X? And say, we can't be doing it this way. And, it's tough, But when I got that confirmation from Tom Hennick, I think it's really a best practice as to how our commissions have to work in this environment. That said, I'm sure you'll hear much more from him when you guys have your training. So I'll move on to conducting meetings. And it's my understanding that your assessor, as ours does, handles a lot of sort of the notice requirements and publications and all of that. So I'm not going to get too bogged down in any of these details, but I would like to point out a few highlights that I think everyone should keep in mind. One is the question of regular versus special meetings. There are a couple key differences. To me, the most important being that if you're holding a regular meeting, you have the flexibility to add agenda items by a 2/3 vote. And the other is notice of regular meetings. If you come up with a schedule of regular meetings for the year and provide notice to your town clerk by January 31st of that year, that's the only notice you're obligated to make. Special meetings, on the other hand, you have to give 48 hours notice, at least 24 hours notice to your town clerk before every special meeting. And the only things that can be discussed in a special meeting are those that are already on the agenda. So if anything pops up, you can't add it to your agenda. When I first started working on our board, we did everything by special meeting, and I remember scratching my head and saying, why are we doing it this way? And it's just the way it's always been done. We have since turned around, and what we do is at our last meeting of September, one of our agenda items is our schedule for the following year. We come up with, and this works for us, we schedule 3 regular meetings in March and 2 in September. We pick specific dates and we pick specific times, and we notify the town clerk, and we have that done. One of the things, I was going to go into it later, but I guess I'll go into it now, is, no, I'll touch on it later. So that's what we do. You can always cancel a meeting if you're not going to use it. And the other thing is, if you need an extra meeting, then fine, schedule one special meeting, but don't paint yourself into a corner where every time you meet, you have to go through all these notice requirements. That would be my recommendation as a best practice. The difference between March and September meetings, I don't know how many people are new to your board, if any, but so I'll just quickly, I guess, run across this topic. March meetings, by statute, are hearings for the real property grand list and the personal property, which I really hate that phrase because it's really business personal property. And then there's a question as to motor vehicles, because the regular registered motor vehicle grand list, those get billed in June, so people can appeal at your September meeting, but there's also towns compile a supplemental registered motor vehicle list. And I believe that billing is done in December or January. This year we had some people who wanted to challenge those appeals. Our assessor said, hey, are you going to hear those? I'm like, do we have to? She's like, her understanding was you don't. I did some research. I dug around. Tried to look into what other towns do. It was really unclear. So we made the decision that yes, we would hear supplemental registered motor vehicle appeals in March, based on the fact that I think, our obligation to our electorate and our taxpayers is to hear their appeals in a timely manner. So if they're getting billed in December or January, why make them wait until the following September when we can listen to them in March? So that's our practice. There's a difference in the way March and September meetings are conducted. For March meetings, taxpayers must, by statute, provide completed written applications no later than February 20th of that year. Those applications must be received, which can include by email or fax, but it does not include postmarked. We have one piece of property in town that's held by trustees in Texas, and every year they FedEx application to us dated February 20th. We received after the fact. We send them a letter saying, you will not be granted a hearing. This was not received in time. I don't know how the owners haven't fired those trustees, but that's the way these regulations work. The applications, there are formalities under the statute as to what they must include. And it's pretty basic stuff. It's the owner's name and address, a description of the property so we can identify it, reason for the appeal, owner's estimated value, signature, or completed certification if you're using an agent. A couple of things that I would point out here, and these are anecdotes for things that we've run across. Description of the property. This should be a specific description that makes the property identifiable. We had someone who came in February this year. He was appealing every assessment, his real property assessment, his supplemental list motor vehicle. Then he finally got around to his business personal property, and he submitted an application that said multiple vehicles list to be provided. And so, I didn't see this application until March when we were preparing for the hearings. And I looked at it, I'm like, this is an incomplete application. I spoke with the assessor and she's like, it was last minute. He was dumping this stack of applications in. So, our board basically agreed that since we were already meeting with him and discussing the other properties, that we would hear this. And it was a real nightmare. He basically just started off the top of his head, rambling off, a 1985 dump truck and this and that. And it almost was like, as he could think up things, he started listing them. And we didn't have any background information. We didn't have, the tax assessment cards for any of this. I think it was probably a wrong decision in retrospect. I think we should have refused to hear that. So, one of the best practices that I'm hoping to introduce this year is you don't have to send out notices of appeal hearings until March 1st. So we basically have 1 week. And I plan to as chair, I plan to sit down with our assessor and go through all the applications. And, if there are any that are questionably, was this completed, was it not, make those determinations then so that we're not in that position again. So I mentioned the March 1st deadline. Taxpayers then have to be given at least 7 days before their hearing. So you really can't conduct your first hearing until March 8th. So what our board does, and I think this is a very good practice, we try to schedule 3 hearing dates every March. We try to do 2 weekday evenings, and we try to do 1 Saturday morning. So what we do is the second week in March, we always schedule like a Wednesday or Thursday evening, and then that Saturday morning. We make sure that our first 2 are in that second week, and then we schedule the other weekday evening for the third week. And we do this so that we're catching folks early on in the month. You have to complete all of your hearings by the end of March. So let's start it early in case we have to add in special meetings. We also do it in the hope that we can get, let's say we're going to have 8 appeals or 10 appeals. Let's get them all during the first 2 sessions so that we can cancel our third meeting. Or this also gives us flexibility. Let's say we're going to have to do a bunch of inspections. Let's schedule those prior to our third meeting so we can then use the agenda for our third meeting for deliberations on our inspections. Then you've still got everything done by the middle of the third week, and you've given yourself an extra 10 days before the end of the month in case you have to schedule anything else. The worst thing a board can do, in my opinion, is wait and do everything late in March and then have the end of the month crush and have to be, seeking extensions and all of that. Do it early, schedule it early. And one of the reasons we do all of our scheduling in September the year before is so that our members can get it in their calendars. That 1 week in March and that 1 week in September, you've already been given, 6 and 12 months notice. Don't schedule a vacation. You're ours for those 2 weeks. So we find that works very well for us as a practice. I touched briefly on September meetings. September meetings are different than March meetings because it's only registered motor vehicles from the regular grand list. Applications advance applications are not required by statute. Some towns, however, do request them. We're one of the towns that's instituted that, only because it's very helpful to know and what's coming before us, so that the assessor can then pull tax records so that you have copies. The worst thing that can happen is somebody shows up and they say, they're flapping a copy of their assessment bill or their tax bill saying, hey, I was assessed at X this year and it was only, X minus 50 last year. What the hell happened? And you have no information in front of you. You don't even know what vehicle's coming. So, asking for or recommending applications in advance really help us get the background information we need, both from the assessor and so that we know it's coming our way. That said, the September hearings, they're not scheduled. They are first come, first serve. So what we do again is we offer one weekday evening after work and one Saturday morning, and we'll set a number of hours. I think we do 2 or 3 hours, I forget. Under the statute, once you've established the time, even if people aren't showing up, you still have to be there for the full amount of time. And 2 years ago, we got locked out of town hall. Our assessor, I don't know if the assessor failed to give me keys or what happened, but we couldn't hold our meetings in town hall. So, and it was for the motor vehicles. It was September. It was a beautiful autumn day. So we sat on the porch and folks drove up. Our parking lot's right in front of the porch anyway. And we held our meeting on the porch and we found it worked brilliantly for us, because one of the things you want to do often is inspect vehicles. They're right there in front of you. I had the tape recorder so we could still, record everyone under oath. And then last year it worked for us because of the pandemic. It allowed us to be outside mass. We're going to continue that practice going forward. We, in fact, are going to continue to hold, weather permitting, our September meetings and appeals and hearings outdoors. We found it works really great. And, we can have the assessor in her office, but close by to pull extra additional information for us. So, I don't know if that would work for you guys. I don't know the physical layout of your properties, but we find it works really great up here. The only other thing that's a little bit different about the September appeals, and this is administrative, is that you have to do a publication of the notice 10 days before your first meeting. I suspect that's something that your assessor handles. Holding a meeting. As I mentioned before, all meetings are open to the public. That means that people can come, people can record, people can photograph within reason. We have one woman in town who is a very strong advocate for transparency in government, and she basically records every board and commission meeting except ours. I feel a little bit insulted, but I suspect probably our subject matter is so boring that she won't put herself through it on her own. But if she ever shows up, she's welcome to attend and to record in advance of a meeting. And if there's one takeaway that you get at all tonight, I would ask you, I assume everyone has a copy of the Board of Assessment Handbook. The latest version is 2017. Before every series of March meetings, before every series of September meetings, read it cover to cover. Well, the last chapter talks about the 3 evaluation processes, cost. Maybe you can skip that one. That's kind of dry. But there is so much information in that book, and it's only like 36 pages. And in particular, the last 6 pages are a Q&A, and they are yes, no. And they answer the most, they're short. They answer the most basic questions like, does the Board of Assessment Appeals have the power to waive the 25% late penalty for failure to file the personal property disclosure statement? No, period. Like, it's great stuff. It's the stuff that, may come up and you'll be like, boom, they're right there. So, and every time I read these, something new pops up out at me. And it's only because, the more of these hearings you go through, the more sort of wacky circumstances you're exposed to. So you read through it, you're like, oh, hell yeah, that's what just happened, last March. So please just, take an hour, consider that your huge prep for the meetings for the month, and read that. Work the other sort of pre-meeting stuff, and I mentioned this before, is working with your assessor, and this goes back to the communication. You know, let her know. Your assessor is a woman, right? Yes. Hello. Okay.
Yes.
So I didn't want. So I know ours is. You know, let her know. You know, when would you like to see the applications? You know, the March applications are filed at least 2 weeks before your meetings. How would you like to receive them? What sort of background information would be helpful for you? You know, clearly you'll probably want a copy of the tax card, but you know, some people want to receive it by email. Some, you know, open communications. I like to get our first assessor. We would show up at our first March meeting. She would hand us the package. That to me was no good. You know, I want to be able to read through. I want to be able to read the evidence that they've provided and formulate questions in advance. Otherwise, you're being caught off guard. You're playing catch up. You're reading this application, and you really can't compile educated questions. So, you know, it goes back again to communication with your assessor, but, you know, talk through it. And I find this is something that's constantly evolving. You know, sometimes we're finding that some people think different information is more helpful. But, you know, I think that as much as you do of that in advance of the meeting, the more valuable the meeting will be. The other thing it'll do is it will help identify issues that may be specific to that particular round of assessments. So in 2015, the Department of Environmental Protection, who dictates the assessed values for forest land, increased the assessed value from like $115 per acre to $240. And you didn't have to apply it until you went through reval, which for us was 2019. But that meant that in 2019, we have a lot of people in Norfolk who have large tracts of property, and they, you know, they make it a point to get their property into this forest category. That meant they were getting huge tax hits. And so, you know, we got a heads up from the assessor, and she was like, this is what you're going to see coming down the pike this year. This is the background information. This is how you understand this topic. It's huge because the last thing you want to do is walk into a hearing and be blindsided by questions as to what does this mean? Why has this happened? And just sort of sit there, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's very helpful. The other thing that our new assessor's done that our old one didn't, and I think it's brilliant, is, you know, she provides us with evidence as well. So she basically provides us a summary of why she took the position she did, the basis, either the statutory or the regulatory basis for her decision, the communications that she has had with the taxpayer up until that point. So, you know, the exchanges they've had. And, you know, I'm a huge advocate of the more information you have, the better the decisions you can make are. I was incredibly pleased when she started instituting that, and I think that we all benefit from it greatly. One of the $2 million questions, I think, in this whole process is, should the assessor join your meetings? There is a whole page, it's page 26 of the handbook, that talks about this, the pros and cons. Our approach is we encourage taxpayers to talk to the assessor before they appeal. A lot of times, what we do, the assessment process isn't something that naturally comes to a lot of people. It can be a very confusing process. So a lot of times just having a taxpayer talk to the assessor and understand the process and understand how valuations were made, or if there are errors, you know, there can be calculation errors, those can be corrected by the assessor. A lot of that avoids any sort of appeal. So we start with that. And we've spent the last year really reaching out to the public. We've had articles in Norfolk Now. We've had our first selectman in his little column explain the assessment process. I was interviewed by a reporter about it. We've spent a great deal of time just reaching out and explaining, how does this process work? I think it's good government, and I think it saves everybody a lot of frustration and headaches. So that's the first approach, but hey, people still won't agree, and we're still gonna have hearings, and it keeps us all in our role. So that's great too. The question is, should the assessor be part of that? And I've tried it with 2 different assessors. I've tried yes in the room, not in the room. And the only thing I can tell you is it's really gotta be a case-by-case determination. We have certain taxpayers who come in and, they feel that the assessor's presence limits their candor, their willingness to be candid, and they find it very repressive. And so that's fine. We'll ask the assessor not to be there. We've had other people who, this turns into this amazing, their hearing turns into this amazing educational exchange where the assessor can answer questions, so there's no delay in having to go through us. And, we can even schedule for the assessor to go and inspect the property because the property owner thinks there are some problems with the tax assessment card. So, sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't. I somewhat mostly let the taxpayers take on that, guide it. There are certain situations when there are sticky or very complicated tax issues. We had a horse ranch farm trail question as to how much property would go into certain categories, and it's just really complicated for a bunch of laymen to understand. And we felt it was important to have the assessor there to help explain to us and to explain to the property owner. So I think I can't give a straight answer on that, but I think that either way works. And basically what the handbook, where they come out, is saying generally available but not present seems to work best unless there's a particularly complicated issue at question. And I think that's probably a good way of going at it. Before any hearing, I'm briefly going to touch on recusals. This is a small town. We all know a lot of the other folks. So, a friendship certainly can't be the basis for a recusal, or we wouldn't get any work done. But there are certain things that clearly require a board member to recuse him or herself. I think family relationships are number one. And, we have some folks here who have deep roots. And, that's a real issue. And, sometimes have to recuse themselves from multiple hearings in the same day. That's fine. But also, business associates, if you have a financial interest, those are pretty clear cut. I think what's not so clear is instances where, has a taxpayer reached out to you and asked you for assistance in preparing, their appeal. I think there's a conflict, there's a recusal there. Or, is a neighbor who you have conflict with over other issues coming before you. Those may not technically require recusal, but I go back to the judiciary analogy and say, if there's even an appearance of impropriety, step back. It's not that important to have you be one of the decision makers on this 15-minute hearing. And what recusal means, it's no participation. I go back to, the familial relationship thing. I think it's very important, and I plan to institute it this year. We haven't in the past, that a member who recuses him or herself should leave the room. You shouldn't be there. You shouldn't be coaching the person. You shouldn't be asking questions. You shouldn't be even providing any support. I think it's very important that whatever we do is completely on the up and up and not challengeable. So that's all basically set up for a meeting. Start of the meeting. Before a hearing starts, we have the taxpayer come in. Before we've started recording, I basically explain to them very briefly how we're going to run this meeting. I tell them they're going to be recorded. They're going to be asked to identify themselves. They're going to be sworn in, and that they'll be given 15 minutes to provide evidence and to answer our questions. The handbook makes it clear that testimony must be given under oath. There's one exception there, and it's for attorneys who are considered officers of the court. So they're not required to be sworn in. Everyone else should be sworn in. And we basically turn the tape player on before the swearing in. taxpayers also must appear either in person or through an authorized agent. So you may get this incredible appeal package, and it's got, proper appraisals, it's got 10 comps, it's got everything to make the perfect argument that this person's assessment should be dropped, and they don't show up. Can't do it, can't act on it. By statute, they have to show up. So, it makes it easier for us. We just deny the appeal. But, it's something else to keep in mind. The other thing is they have to answer all your questions touching on the taxable property situated in the town that's at question. And the only reason I raise this, and it particularly in my experience comes up with respect to business personal property, people are squirrely. And, I like to see the best in people, but I've been through enough of these hearings where I see the worst in people, and you have people lying to your face, and it's really hard. So my only advice there is press hard, and it may be uncomfortable, but you've really got to press. I mentioned recording. Generally, you're only required to record the hearing part, not your deliberations. This was pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, there was an executive order handed down that required, with Zooms and all of that, that we record the full, the full session, the full meeting from beginning to end, and that it be posted on a town's website. I'm hoping that with the opening up of the state in the next couple of weeks, that executive order will also go away. Evidence. Basically, the key for the taxpayers is to present evidence and to argue their case. I personally think that comparables are the strongest, sort of the strongest evidence. Appraisals can be very helpful, but I would warn you all to be careful that they are not definitive as to value, and you have to make sure that they're using an appropriate revaluation date. And I raise this because, not this time around, because we're seeing in property values increase, real property values increase, but our last, 7 years ago, what we found is we went through a reval and then property values were sinking. So 3 or 4 years later, someone would be showing up and saying, hey, my property isn't worth this much money. Well, you'd have to say, well, yes, but we're basing this, and they'd show up with comps. So they would show up with, my next door neighbor just sold his house last week for this, and it's so much less. It doesn't matter what they sold it for in 2017 if our reval was done in 2013 and your assessment is based on 2013. You're going to have to wait till 2018. So, you have to make sure that appraisals are based on the right date and that comps are based on a date that's around the revaluation date. The first year into a reval, it may not be, or into a 5-year period, it may not be that important, but your 5th year, a current comp is pretty much kindling, in my opinion. There can also be things presented, brokers, price opinions, there are BPOs. I give those minimal value. Brokers aren't held to the same regulations or standards as appraisers. They may be helpful as far as describing the property and showing you how many bedrooms and baths and things like that, but it's one broker's opinion. I wouldn't give it too much weight. So basically what I think we need to keep in mind is that unless there's a glaring error in an assessment, the BAA should have a justifiable rationale for making changes in keeping with the town's assessment system. And the onus is on the taxpayer to provide an argument and evidence on which to base that change. And that's sort of, the rules slip by. I mentioned it once before, but one of the things we can't do is we can't reduce assessments for hardship. And particularly with the pandemic in the last year, we heard some pretty sad stories this year. And we heard excuses for why people didn't get their personal property disclosure statements in by November 1st deadline. And, it breaks your heart, but we're applying the law as it's written. And, if I give you a break because I feel sorry for you, that means your neighbor's picking up the slack. So you kind of have to be hard-hearted at some points. I touched briefly on site visits and property inspections. If you decide to schedule them, our best practices, we try to get our entire board to make the inspection. At a minimum, I really like 2 sets of eyes there. You can have one person go and, report back to the board. I personally just like 2 different perspectives there. My big recommendation there is, before you waste your time and the taxpayers' time, be prepared. Really study the property tax card. And then little things like bring a paper and pencil for taking notes. And I find the best tool I have is I have one of those laser measuring tapes, because you'll have property owners say, hey, there's always a little footprint in our property assessment cards that shows the footprint of the property, saying, hey, these measurements are off. You stand there and measure from wall to wall with a laser thing, and you do find errors. Or my own property, my basement is built on a rock, so half of at the ceiling level, sure, it may be 20 by 40 or whatever, but as the rock slopes down into my basement, the floor level, it's 10 by 20. That's not livable, usable, storageable space. Those are the sort of corrections that can very easily be made on a tax card. And when you're doing a site visit, the things you should be watching out for. The other thing I would note on these is that homeowners can refuse inspections, either by us or during the revaluation process. I would also direct you to Q&A number 20 in the Board of Assessment Appeals handbook, which says, which asks whether or not a BAA can reduce a real estate assessment when the homeowner has denied an inspection. And it says, well, the statute doesn't preclude it, it's not recommended. And I personally agree with that. I think the onus is on the taxpayer to provide evidence for why their assessment should be changed. And if they're not willing to open up and show you why, then, I think that raises some doubts. Deliberations and decisions. So you've done your site visit, you've had your testimony. Basically, now the board sits down and does their deliberations and decisions. And, unless it's a question of mathematical error or exemptions or special classifications that are being challenged, our job boils down to being tasked with determine fair market value. And fair market value is defined as, there are many definitions. The one I like to work with is the amount for which a property may be exchanged for cash within a reasonable period of time and in an open and competitive market under conditions in which both unrelated parties are willing, able, and reasonably well informed. The reason I read it for that to you is to point out that fair market value is not necessarily sale price. And I think that's something that many purchasers don't understand. They say, the house has been on the market for 2 weeks or a month or whatever, and I paid X number of dollars, so that's what the market's willing to pay for it. Well, there are other factors that can come into play. Fire sales. Somebody has a mortgage on another house and they have 2 weeks and it's contingent on selling their house. They're willing to take a lower price. Or look at the other direction. I have one neighbor. If I ever caught wind that she was willing to sell, I would pay a substantial premium to not ever have a neighbor again. But nobody else will pay that premium that I'm willing to pay. Related parties, you're probably going to give your son a better deal on the house than you are the New Yorker who's moving up here. So I raise it because, fair market value determinations, you have to take these factors into consideration, and you can't just rely on recent sale prices. When it comes to making adjustments during our deliberations, we sort of breaking it down by different categories. Under real property, the first thing we do is we look for errors on the tax card. Part of our 15 minutes is, and our former chair was really great at it, he would take the first 2 minutes and say, hey, homeowner, looking at this property, is this the year it was built? Is this Is the square footage right? Are the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms? It's really, if you find errors there, those are the easiest adjustments to make. They're not questionable. They're not, objectionable to anyone. So I would suggest starting there. The other thing is you sort of have to educate the taxpayers on what factors are taken to consideration in the assessment process. So for instance, quality of construction is a factor. A house with plaster walls is considered more valuable than a house with dry walls. However, aesthetics, which a lot of homeowners think come into play, and they come into play probably in the sales price, don't come into play in the assessment. So for instance, if you have Formica counters from the 50s in your kitchen, and I have granite counters from last week in my kitchen, our assessment value, they're not taking that into consideration. That's not one of the factors when you look at the tax card. So, part of our job and part of the assessor's job is educating taxpayers as to how this works and what factors are taken into consideration. The other thing with real property that I would remind everyone to look at is completed building permits. One of the things that will trigger will be the assessor making a change in the assessment and sending out a new assessment, and then folks will likely challenge that. And we have it all the time. Look and see how much the building permit was taken out for, and ask some pretty probing questions there. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the argument, well, we spent $50,000 on the house, but it's because it's chilly and drafty, so it really didn't add any value other than, keeping us warmer and saving energy. I'm like, well, you put in heated floors and brand new windows. That does add to the value. So, those are factors to look into. I guess one of the final things I would say about real property is that during any 5-year a reval period, once a property assessment has been appealed, it may not be appealed again until the next reval or until there's been a change in the property. So for instance, if there's been demolition or there's been construction, but a property owner can't come before your board. You can't make an adjustment or, not make an adjustment, leave it unchanged. And then they can't keep coming back year after year. There has to be a change before they can come back before you. The BAA is not limited to just decreasing assessments or making no changes. We actually have the power to increase assessments. In my 4 years on our board, we've never done it, but I can tell you there have been times when the more we've drilled down on building permit completions, we've been tempted to. And you sort of make a mental note for the next reval to make sure that these changes in the property are looked at. And I guess the last thing I would mention with respect to reval, so every 5 years by statute, towns have to go through the revaluation process for real property. And I guess the big warning there is the following year, particularly when we went through our last one in Norfolk, real property values were actually decreasing. So most people in town were happy, their assessed values went down, the mill rate may have gone up, but people were generally happy. You didn't get a lot of appeals, but we've seen a lot of folks moving into Norfolk in the last year. It's been a super hot market, and I expect if this continues, we go through reval again in 2023, I believe. I think there's going to be a sticker shock. So I only mention that because you should be prepared. When real property goes up and assessments and appraisal values go up, you can go from having, we can go from having 10 appeals to 100 appeals. So those 3 days that I've blocked out in March may end up being 3 weeks, but it's just something to keep in mind. So other than real property, one of the things that we hear appeals for is personal property, business personal property. I will have to admit it's probably the worst part of our job, and it's the part I hate the most. It's really hard. A lot of this is things like, 27-year-old dump trucks, or, trailers, or things that it's just really hard to get a fair market value for. A lot of these, a lot of this equipment is used. I was shocked to learn, bulldozers and things like that. People run those for 40 and 50 years. So when it comes to finding comps, it can be really difficult. We spend a lot of time online, and, all three of our members are sitting there saying, well, I found something that's within 3 years out in Wichita. It's a very hard determination to make. So I would just say that be creative. Look at the prior assessed values. Become pretty savvy doing Google searches. Yeah. I really just don't care for them. But the other things the other thing is print off your comps. One of the things we have done and not necessarily been so great at in the past, but I want to make sure we do in the future is, when we find that comparable dump truck, let's make sure we print off a copy of it. It's kind of hard to do when we're sitting out on the porch doing some revals, but let's print off a copy of it and keep it for the files. Because if our decisions are ever appealed, it's something that's discoverable, and it's something that supports our evaluation determination. As I mentioned before, personal property declarations are due by November 1st of each year. That's basically business personal property. Otherwise, they're subject to a 25% penalty. That penalty cannot be waived by the Board of Assessment Appeals. However, if the board makes a determination, so if the personal property value or appraised values are challenged and the board lowers the appraised value, then the penalty will be lowered proportionately. If a taxpayer fails to file a personal property declaration, then the assessor is authorized to basically complete one for that taxpayer. That can be really complicated. We had an instance where our assessor found someone advertising in the local newspaper and putting up business cards all over town, starting a landscaping business, let's say, but didn't file a personal property declaration. So, she then goes through and says, okay, what sort of equipment do you need to run a business, like lawnmowers and weed whackers? And you read the description of what the work they perform and figure out the equipment. And, she does her best faith effort to complete this declaration, which then immediately gets challenged, by statute. Basically, then it's on the taxpayer to provide evidence that that's not right. So, the personal property stuff can get very complicated. I guess my advice would be patient with it. Registered motor vehicles, I mentioned before, assessors are directed by the State Office of Policy Management to use the NADA average retail price clean retail value standard. The problem there is it doesn't take into consideration actual vehicle condition or mileage. So it's my understanding the assessors get a list of vehicles and years, 2013 Honda Civic, and they look across the line in the NAD guide and it says it's worth $23.90, and that's what it's assessed at. It doesn't matter if it has, 1,000 miles on it or 100,000 miles on it. That's very frustrating for our taxpayers, particularly the ones who have come and appealed, and, often they'll bring their cars and they'll say, it's super high mileage, or it's rusted out, or this, that, or the other thing. And we as the board will look at it and we'll knock the assessment down. But we've also been very proactive in explaining that under the statute, this is going to be a recurring issue. And, we sort of make a joke sometimes at the end and say, we'll see you next September. Because, the assessor then next year gets the list for motor vehicles, and you know, they don't take that into consideration. They can't take that into consideration in doing their evaluation. And I always thought that was unfair, but then I put some thought into it, and I realized that, okay, so we may knock down the assessed value of a car because it's banged up. Well, you know what? The owner can get that thing repaired, and then the next year it's not banged up. Or a high mileage 1-year-old car this year that has, you know, 25,000 miles on it, so we knock down the assessment, isn't driven for a year, and next year it's a 2-year-old car with an average of 12.5 per year. It's a low mileage car, it's an average mileage car. So there is oddly some rationale behind the crazy methodology that the state imposes on us. That said, it's very frustrating for taxpayers, and you know, we've just learned to be sympathetic and tell them, you know, this is how this process works, and we will see you again next year. Notice of decisions, minutes, and record keeping. So you've made your determinations, you've had your deliberations. What next? Taxpayers must receive a notification in writing of a decision within 1 week, and it must include information about the right to appeal. Pretty straightforward. Minutes. I mentioned before there are $2 million questions. One of them was, should the assessor be in the room? The second one, in my opinion, is how much information goes into your minutes? All actions, which I interpret to mean resolutions, must be recorded in the minutes. Fine. Also, you must file a record of all votes within 48 hours after a meeting. You don't have to file your minutes for 7 days. However, our board, and I suspect a lot of boards, use their minutes as the record of their votes. So basically what that means is that after our meeting, we have 48 hours for our secretary to draft up minutes that set forth, and there's certain information that you have to put in there. You have to put the name of the party, the property that was appealed, the old assessed value, the new assessed value, and the vote of the members. That's the bare minimum that needs to go into the minutes. And that's what I advocate for our board to put in the minutes. Since we're doing it quickly, and since I mentioned before with the Freedom of Information Act guidance we received that we can't all comment on it, we're basically asking our secretary to draft up minutes that then become our public notice, and they sit out there until we have our next meeting to discuss them. So I think that putting the minimum information in that complies and that gets the information out there, but without a lot of extra verbiage that will then need to be corrected or reviewed, is the way to go. Guidance, even in the it contradicts. On page 20, it states that, and I quote, "In-depth notes regarding the appeal are key elements for the minutes." Wow, that means we need extensive discussions, right? That's how I read that. But then question number 14 at the end says, while the discussion is not required to be listed, okay, you've already contradicted yourself, the BAA must identify each property and the corresponding vote of each board member so as to comply with FOI requirements as a public meeting. Discussion or notes, including the reasons for board members' action, are often helpful to assessors going forward, and it is recommended that they be included in the BAA file if possible. Well, that says it would be nice to have them in there, but you don't have to. I think that, you know, the more information you put there in a rush when you're trying to get it done in 48 hours and without having other sets of eyes looking at it, the more chance there is of having there be mistakes or having other board members say, hey, you've mischaracterized in your discussion in the minutes how I thought I presented, or the arguments that I made, or, you know, things that I may have said. So I would advocate for less is more in this instance. Under the BAA handbook, it sounds like you can go either way. But my other argument for that is under freedom of information and in a court case, both the minutes and our personal handwritten notes and any other files we have are discoverable. or under freedom of information need to be disclosed. So, the information can be available in one place or the other. I would just prefer that it, let them come for my notes if they want, which sort of moves next then into record retention, which the minimum record retention rule, including appraisals and any related notifications, is 1 year if no court appeal is taken. After a decision is made, I forget, it's either 2 or 3 months the taxpayers have to appeal. So within a year, you should know whether or not your decision's being appealed. As far as a best practice goes, what I encourage our board members to do is, after our deliberations, pretty much after our whole March sessions are done, let's give all of our notes. Let's give everything we had. Let's give the comps. Let's give the the assessor's reports, everything that we used in our deliberations to the assessor. Let's tape them up in an envelope and store them in her office for a minimum of a year. I think that's probably a good way to go there. So you've had your deliberations, you've made your decisions. The one thing I would recommend you put on your agenda for your meetings after that is meet with the assessor, because one of the things you're going to want to do is let the assessor know, okay, this is what we've done. We've decided to make these changes to the grand list or to the personal property appraisals. Letters will have to be produced that go out that reflect those changes. Changes will have to be made to the property cards and the grand list. Make it an agenda item, and sit down with your assessor before you adjourn your meeting and just talk through. It also helps for her to have an understanding of your rationale for these decisions, because most likely a taxpayer who then receives the letter in a week or two will call her office. And so if she knows you're thinking and knows why you've done what you've done, it will help her explain to the taxpayers. My one final thing on that is, as far as discussing your taxpayers, and this is my personal approach, is I don't discuss any of these tax decisions with taxpayers out in the real world. Again, it's a lot of, you run into your friends, they come before you. I just think that there's danger in doing that. I don't want to misspeak. I don't want to hold myself out as speaking on behalf of the entire board. And I don't have the records in front of me. So, it's tough. I've been in situations, I was in a horrible situation where a friend came before us with a farmland issue and we didn't have the proper certifications. We took her farmland out of that classification. She got a huge tax bill. I went to a cocktail party at her house. Like an idiot, I commented on the beautiful view, and she said, well, I'm paying through my nose for it because you people on the Board of Assessment Appeals refused my farmland designation. And then she wanted to talk about it. You just don't want to get into that. I'm going to end with a couple special situations that may arise with respect to special properties. One is antique motor vehicles. This is one that we've really dealt with a lot in Norfolk. Connecticut law provides that the assessed value of, and this is a quote, antique, rare, or special interest vehicle, end quote, is capped at $500.
Wow.
To qualify, a vehicle must meet 3 criteria. One is it must be at least 20 years old. That's fine. That's objective, verifiable. Second is it must being preserved because of historic interest. Wow, talk about squishy language. And, I've done a lot of research in this. There isn't even any information on what that means in the legislative history behind this law. So there's a big wide open gap you can drive a truck through. And the third is not altered or modified from the original manufacturer's specs. So the question then becomes, how do you meet those 3 criteria? If the person has gone to DMV and got antique car plates, automatically qualifies, you knock it down to $500. That's easy. But you don't need to pay the extra $36 or whatever it is for antique car plates in order to get this. The other way is the assessor may, that's always a dangerous word, require the owner to provide, and this is the other dangerous phrase, reasonable documentation that the vehicle is an antique, rare, or special interest vehicle. There is a lot of wiggle room language there. Our prior assessor she didn't require any documentation. She basically would go through the motor vehicle list, anything that was 20 years or over, she knocked down to $500. Taxpayers loved it. Was it in compliance with the statute? I would argue no. She didn't know that it hadn't been altered or modified from the original manufacturer's specs. If you take an old car and turn it into a hot rod, it's not entitled to this. She had no way of knowing that. Taxpayers loved it. New assessor came in and said, that's not the right approach. So I may require reasonable documentation. She's taken the approach that the person has to show her evidence that they've insured the car as an antique. Question came to us. I did a very extensive survey online of probably 50 or 60 different municipalities in the state of Connecticut to see how they deal with it. And it is all over the board. Most of them, I would say, just require a simple affidavit. You need the taxpayer to fill something out that under oath, they say that it meets these criteria. Some require a notarized affidavit, some require pictures, some require a questionnaire regarding how the car is being preserved and its historic use. And there are even some that require mechanics certifications. Our board sat down and, as a group, we determined that anyone who comes before us is given an oath. So they are testifying under oath of perjury. And if they testify that their vehicle satisfies these criteria, that we think that's sufficient. So this is one of the instances where we do not see eye to eye with our assessor. We don't control the assessor's evaluation in this. She can make her evaluation, but folks who come before us, we've made it clear that, this is the approach we'll take with respect to their vehicles. Other issues may arise. We had someone who came before us, engines die. So a 22-year-old car put a new engine in. Our assessor said, well, no, that's been modified. They showed us evidence that it was to the exact same specs. It was the same valves and power and all of that. We made the determination that it had, in effect, it had not been modified then because it was to the same specs and entitled to the $500 assessed value. Farms, forest, and open space land classifications. That's called Public Act 490. I mentioned it very briefly before. It's huge here in Norfolk. I'm not sure if it is, how big it is in the rest of the state. But in general, the statute provides for certain lands to be assessed at their use value rather than their fair market value or the highest and best use value. And that basically means they're assessed at super low values compared to what it would be in any other sort of classification or categorization. So people fight very hard for these classifications. You automatically lose it upon sale. A new owner has to reapply for these classifications. Farmland in particular, the only thing I would point out there is that it's popular in our area, particularly among wealthy weekenders who basically, let a farmer come in, hay their fields, use the hay to feed their livestock, get a certification, and then they get a huge tax break. A couple things to keep in mind is that it needs to be done every year. You can't even skip a year or you fall out of the classification and have to reapply. And our old assessor on her way out the door provided a memo to our board. And these are her words. The farm classification is the most widely abused tax credit program administered by my office and must be constantly reviewed to assure compliance. It's one of those things that, you have to be diligent about. We've had people come in and argue, my field couldn't get hayed because we had a very wet fall. Well, you know what? All the other farmers in the area found a way to get out there and get it hayed. And under the law, you miss 1 year, you're out. You've got to reapply next year, but this year you're getting hit with a pretty steep tax bill. I mentioned before the forest land classification, that basically you need 25 plus acres to be eligible for that. and it's the State Department of Environmental Protection that assigns land use values. They don't change that often. It changed in 2010, 2015, so who knows, maybe we're due for one soon. But those can be a real big hit on folks that have large tracts of property, much of which they leave in forest. And the last thing I would mention is farm equipment and horse exemption up to $100,000. This, I wasn't at all familiar with this, and it came up this year because farmers are entitled to one such exemption. So we had a farmer who's based out of Colebrook who was keeping I think it was a horse trailer in Norfolk. So since that horse trailer is kept here, it's taxable here. He claimed, oh, no. He goes, you know, that's part of my $100,000 farm exemption in Colebrook. So we actually had to reach out to the Colebrook assessor's office and get a copy of his exemption application. And part of those applications is they have to provide a schedule of all the equipment that doesn't exceed $100,000 in value that is subject to that exemption. And we had to go through and check pages of equipment, and sure enough, that horse trailer was not listed on it. So it was not subject to the exemption, and it was taxable in our town. You know, we don't want to play ogres. We're not trying to squeeze every last dime we can out of folks. So, we reached out to our assessor and we said, this is how this is played out. And we would recommend that, can you reach out to him and say, next year, put it on your list, do it this. So, I'm sort of going to end with that because I could give anecdotes until the cows come home. But I'm hoping that I hit on a bunch of sort of salient topics to keep in mind, and I'm happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability. Yeah. I can't hear you. Are you muted?
I had to go get my computer charger and I didn't want to make noise. So in any case, okay, we're in a hearing, and I've benefited occasionally by taking a ride by a house after a hearing, because previously we would do executive session and we wouldn't even complete necessarily in front of the public. We understand now we have to complete in front of the public during that meeting. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, there are very few reasons you can go into executive session, and I can't imagine any of them would apply to a BAA.
Okay, so having learned that in our last session, okay, formally last year, I took a ride by some of the properties afterwards and included that information, to the panel. And then we made our decision. So we didn't make it in front of them. But is there a way to say during a hearing, we'd like to take a ride by and we'll get back to you? Or,
well, you said that you did a ride by and then you came back, and so at some point you discussed with your board, right? And made that, well, that should all have been public. That discussion should have been public. So in that, so you individually going by, that's fine. And I would actually encourage it.
But previously, you would encourage it previously or after a hearing?
I think either way, it doesn't matter. Basically what you don't want to do, what I wouldn't want to do is go through the deliberations, make a decision, take a drive by, notice facts, come back and reopen that. I
guess I'm saying you're postponing the decision because you want to take a ride by. So what would you do in that case? Reconvene?
Yeah, because you're not going to be able to deliberate and make a decision unless you're in an open public meeting. So, it's not like the three of you can just get on a call and say, okay, you can't call them and say, hey, I drove by and I saw X, Y, and Z. That's not how you can make a decision. All your decisions have to be made in a public meeting.
What is that reconvening? Is that a special meeting or it is?
Unless you have a regular meeting scheduled.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
You've got to call a special meeting.
That's complicated. Okay.
Oh yeah. No, that's why we try to keep one extra regular meeting on our schedule at the end, so you can do all your drive-bys, you can do all your inspections. We can go ahead and get information from the Colebrook assessor, and then so basically we punt on anything we need more information on, and then at our last regular meeting we make all those deliberations and decisions.
So if we wanted more information, or if we said to someone, you really needed to bring us an income statement, which you didn't do. So we could give them an opportunity to bring it at the following, at that extra meeting we have in reserve.
Yep. Yep.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant idea.
We love them. Particularly in March. I mean, it doesn't matter so much with the vehicles in September, but I highly recommend do your meetings early. And so you leave your extra 10 days buffer and leave yourself an extra meeting because you don't know what's going to arise. And best case scenario, you just cancel the damn thing.
Walter, I had just a quick question if the board doesn't mind. I know for this appeal this year, new to our board was personal property. They never had that come up before.
I'm so sorry.
Lucky them. What do you feel is reasonable for the resident to come forth with in terms of evidence for their arguing their case?
Oh, goodness. It's so hard there because real property, it's nice. Comps and things like that. Personal property, we find it's more of a conversation we have with the person. A lot of times and so much of it is us climbing a learning curve. So, I mentioned before, I didn't know that so much of this equipment has 40 and 50 year lives. If people want to show up and say, we've had people show up with bills of sale. And, we had, in fact, this came up this year. I think we had our assessor had assessed a piece of personal property at $4,000, let's say. And this person showed up and say, hey, I purchased this and here's a copy of my bill of sale from a Ford dealer here in town, or, in the region 12 years ago for $3,800. That's pretty strong evidence. And, it's no fault of the assessor either. So much of this personal property is so difficult to find a value on. But we've also had folks show up with comps that they've pulled off of the internet. A lot of this stuff is sold at auction, like equipment auctions and car dealer auctions. We've had Winnebagos are tough. Winnebagos are particularly tough because with the pandemic, their values went through the roof. So your 10-year-old Winnebago 2 years ago that was worth $3,000 may have been worth like $15,000 this year. And unfortunately, we take that into consideration as well. So a lot, we're always grateful for any evidence folks will bring, but a lot of it is them explaining to us, this is what the property is. The other thing you'll find with a lot of the personal property is that, it's a trailer for hauling whatever. There are 12 different models. So we use a lot of that time to help us figure out the exact model here so that we can, research that. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and we're hearing that values are going to go up with motor vehicles with all of COVID too. Because,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And houses. I mean, I think it's going to be.
So we may be very busy this time or next March. I was kind of more in terms of businesses, but I guess it's more of a conversation that they have with the residents in terms of what this business is or what it's producing. But I just know that I just wanted your take on that. That's all.
Yeah, our problem is, we don't have a lot of like brick and mortar businesses in town. So we don't get a lot of, like, for instance, computer software questions. What we have is the folks who are running farms or landscaping, or, we have the alpha dealer guy. So, so I can only speak to my own experience. I don't know how, what a soft serve ice cream machine is worth. I would have no idea how to value that.
I have a question. You said that the applicant must appear.
Yep.
Can they have someone appear for them?
They can. If in order to do so, however, the application has ours. It's in a box, but every application is. They basically have to authorize that person in writing, and they have to sign. They have to provide both that person's name, they have to sign that this person is authorized, and then their agent or their attorney must be sworn in and must appear. But, you know, then that person has to appear. There has to be someone who appears.
Joel pointed out earlier, we've never sworn in anybody.
Yeah, you have to.
So every time we start with a new
Yep.
member of the public, we swear them in before we start. Okay.
And I'd mentioned before that every time I read the manual, I learn something, handbook, I learn something new. The statutory language says may, you know, may administer an oath. And then you read, I saw the sentence in the handbook that said that, you know, although it's may, it's been interpreted to mean must. And then there's a Q&A that says must. So, you know, a lot of this is you know, who knows if a court interpreted it at some point that, you know, the may is out, but it's pretty clear in the, it shows up in a number of places in the BAA handbook that you must do this under oath.
So statutes don't override handbook, handbook overrides statutes?
Well, I think that, no, the handbook isn't the one that's saying that you have to, it's saying that subsequent interpretation. So a court has probably interpreted that statute
Gotcha.
to say may means must. So, and I always take, you know, maybe it's the cautious attorney in me, I always take the position that it takes 10 seconds to read it. It's probably just as well to have this, you know, then they're under, you know, threat of perjury too. So.
Okay.
Don, I put the oath in your handbook. There's a
Thank you.
copy in there.
We're gonna need a little script. Yes.
It's all there.
Well, in all honesty, when we started ours, you know, because you only do it every 6 months, so you forget things. And I want to say our first couple people in March, I forgot to administer the oath, and the other attorney on my board was like, "Hey, numbnut, administer the oath." So it happens. Anything else?
Well, Walter, I can't thank you enough for, I've learned a few things, and I hope that the board did as well, and appreciate your time you've taken here for Winchester.
No, I
And,
apologize again for wasting your time and, you know, your first 20 minutes not being on. And if anyone has any questions, you know, I can talk about this till the cows come home. So, you know, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. And if I can help, I'm happy.
Joe's raising his hand. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, so my question is just on the farm designation. So we make determinations on farms. What defines the farm designation? You'd mentioned baling hay. So what exactly defines the farm? And for
I would refer you to Public Act 490. No, it's actually,
no.
it's
Okay.
one of those areas that's very complicated. And it's one of the things you work with your assessor to, you know, to fully understand. And,
In
you know,
statute 1-1Q,
thank you.
that is.
I mean, it's
what you need to read.
complicated stuff.
sounds like a topic for another day.
Yeah. But you know, again, that's perfect. That's a perfect question because, you know, now you're aware, you know, as long as you're aware of it and know where to look, then you can do the digging. But boy, it's the sort of thing that goes in one ear and out the other.
So look, let me just, so what we're saying, it's not a matter of valuation. It's a matter of for the farm designation, we have to decide whether it's applicable. That if they're challenging that.
Well, generally the challenge will be is they've had the designation in the past and it's been taken away. And we have to determine, was it fair that it was taken away? And, you know, that goes back to so much of what my year this year has all been about educating the public, because I really think that the more our taxpayers understand this process, the fewer of these issues we're going to have. And, you know, the education part for me is reminding people that, okay, you may lose it for 1 year, but you can reapply next year. You know, it's going to be a tough hit this year, but, you know, now you're aware of it. Now you know what you need to do. And, you know, that's one of the things that I think also, you know, it's very helpful then to have an assessor who's like, you know, I will walk you through the stages and this is what, now you've learned what you need. And if you have any questions, don't wait until the 11th hour. You know, don't wait until it's too late to get a farmer in here to hay. You know, talk to me in August.
Yeah, just so you know, you can turn your volume down or just hit mute on your keyboard. I can speak for Are you getting the reverb?
Spooky.
Is for Winchester and what I do in my other two towns, I do farm verification letters every other year. I'd like to be proactive to keep an eye on folks to make sure that they're doing exactly what they signed up to do, because it's so subjective. Also, I had an appeal in Colebrook this year where there was 26 acres. He applied for 26 acres in a farm. I gave him 19. He has since brought us to court because I didn't give him enough farm. So he's suing me over that other 7 acres. So, but I also documented extensively asking the questions, please provide me. I asked them to provide me with documentation, receipts for XYZ, the type of farming that you do, you know, all sorts of things, and nothing was supplied to me. 19 acres was actually generous. But it's a very slippery slope when it comes to classifying farmland and trying to get a good balance. And because I want to be able to help the farmer, but he also needs to help me help him. And that's really important. And you guys will rely on questions such as that come time, if it does come time, because I am sending out farm verifications. We are, Jill and I, this year. And I imagine we're going to get some pushback because people have kind of been getting away with a lot without accountability. So.
And your predecessor in Norfolk had the same view that, you know, I want to do everything I can to help farmers. But so when, you know, her parting gift to us was a memo saying that this is the most abused provision in the tax. I was like, you know, you really, it's hard. You want to help the small, particularly the small farmer, you know, which is mostly what we have up in this region. But again, it goes back to, we've got to make sure that we're distributing tax responsibilities fairly. And if it's one of those areas that, you know, people take advantage of, that, you know, we have to be mean.
It's a lot of gray.
Yeah.
A lot of gray, unfortunately, and nobody's happy. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Walter.
Is that it?
Yep. I think.
Okay. Thank you all very
All
much.
good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good
Great,
night.
useful.
Thanks.